I'm Sherry Jordan. I'm the CEO for the Edmond Chamber of Commerce. I want to welcome you this morning to our Diversity and Inclusion series. We have partnered with the City of Edmond to have this program, and we're well on our way with it, and we're very appreciative of their sponsorship. And I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Goodpasture, and she's the Human Resources Director for the City of Edmond. Good morning, Lisa.
Good morning. I just want to say that the city is honored to be hosting the D&I series and partnering with the Chamber. I would also like to say that our City of Edmond leaders are dedicated to bringing awareness to our community and to our city staff. Sherry, I would like to thank you and your staff for bringing us excellent conversations and information about equality and inclusion. And very excited to hear this series because it hits very close to home. And with that being said, I'd like to throw that back to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Now I'm going to introduce our committee chairman. Mayor Darrell Davis has been instrumental in helping us get this program off the ground and keep it going. He is a graduate of Leadership Edmond Class 14. He started as an Edmond City Councilman in 2011, but before that, he served on the Parks and Rec Advisory Board as well as Public Works. He has been our mayor for over a year now, right?
No,
Yeah?
still less than a year.
Oh, gosh. Well, it's been a rough year.
Yes.
Oh, my goodness. Mayor Davis recently retired from Tinker Air Force Base. He was the chief of the Installation Contracting Division, and he was also the recipient of the 2019 Leadership Edmond Alumni of the Year. So please give a virtual welcome to Mayor Darrell Davis.
Thank you, Sherry. Yay! Oh, what a great topic we have today, because we talk about bias, implicit biases, and I tell everybody, and you've heard me speak before on all of our D&I series, is that we all have our biases. But today we're going to explore deeper. We have Dr. Rosemary Avance.
It's Avance.
Avance? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
you're not the only one. Everybody wants to make it sound like it's French or maybe Spanish, but no, it's just Avance.
Avance. Well, got to get it correct. But she's assistant professor of media and strategic communications at Oklahoma State University. And that is something critical that in our D&I, that's one of the things we've always talked about, is the importance of communication. Her teaching and research focus on issues related to identity and representation, with special interest in Native American representation and disability rights. She also serves on the College of Arts and Science Equity Advocates Fellow. But please, everyone, let's welcome Dr. Rosemary Avance, and let's get our questions. Let's have some questions for her. As I said before, you sit around the water cooler and you come up with questions and conversations. Here's your opportunity this morning. Doctor, we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. This is a presentation. This is a version of a presentation that I give at OSU in various departments. It's a main concern here, just like it is in the city of Edmond, to try to be more intentional when we address diversity and equity issues. We know that we need more diverse faculty, more diverse staff, more diverse students in our programs. And OSU is a very white school. So we're primarily right now, we're focusing on bringing in more people of color into positions. The problems we're realizing is that we have built white supremacy into our hiring practices in a way that many people are not aware. And we don't do it intentionally. We do it because we have these implicit biases that kind of guide our expectations. And so we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about what implicit biases are, and then come up with some strategies that we can use in the workplace to try to prevent those biases that we all have from taking over our decision-making processes and preventing us from having more equitable working environments. So just like Darrell mentioned before, I'm prefer for you to interact as we talk and to ask questions when you have them and to just interrupt me. I'm a professor, so that's what my students do. They just stop me and, what are you talking about? What does that mean? Or sometimes they might want to argue with me. And I prefer that. You don't want to listen to me just talk on Zoom for an entire hour. But if you have questions as we're going or something isn't clear, please just speak up. I may not see it if you do the hand raise on Zoom, just because when I'm sharing my screen, I may not see everyone. So it'd be much better if you just kind of like yell at me, and I'm used to it. So I also have 3 kids at home, so I get yelled at quite a bit anyway. So now I'm going to share my screen with you and walk you through a presentation. This presentation is geared at educating people who are decision makers in departments, but also places of work, to help you understand what this concept is about, and then how you can create some strategies in your own policies and processes to work around it. Okay, so there's a couple of different objectives that I have for today. First of all, I want you to be aware of some of the impacts that these different types of biases can have on your hiring and retention and evaluation in particular. So those are the issues that we'll focus on. Implicit biases can do a lot of things in the workplace. Beyond these things, they can impact all areas of interaction, collegiality, and even just smaller things like who you mentor and who you don't mentor, which leads to things like retention and evaluation. But we're going to focus specifically on these processes for the short time that we have together today. The next part, my next objective, is to help us to develop some specific skills. Like, what can we do about it? It's great to know that we have them, but then you feel pretty helpless unless you know what to do next. And we're also going to talk about the importance of bias training in your organizations. So it's great to be aware of it as a leader of an organization. But if you don't pass that knowledge on to people who are making decisions within all of the organizations that you're a part of, that knowledge doesn't really affect any change. And finally, because this is a way that we can actively prioritize diversity and equity, actually doing something about it, kind of putting our money where our mouth is instead of just, saying that we value it. This is a way that we can learn how to put it into action in our lives and in our workplaces. And so that's what I hope you take away from this presentation today. First, I want you to think, just kind of think about your life and think about your personal experiences in the workplace or elsewhere. Have you ever had an experience where you felt sure that someone was biased against you just because of who you are? Something about you, your gender, your representation, or your presentation, your race or ethnicity, anything like that, the way that you looked. I think most of us probably have had an instance where we think someone had some sort of bias against us. I'm curious if anyone has something come to mind that you'd like to share.
I've had one experience was my political party.
Oh, yeah. It's easy to make assumptions about people if you know very limited information about them. And political parties are a way we quickly categorize people so we can say, like, they are like me and they are not like me. So that's a great example. Any other examples come to mind?
Yes, I've been just the color of my skin, my height, that has been verbally told to me during my career.
Wow. Yeah. Typically, anything that is physical that people see when they first see you, those are the first judgments people make. And then when they get to know a little more detail about you, they can make more judgments. So it's all aspects of your identity are kind of up for bias in this situation. Can you think of a time when you have ever been biased against someone else because of who they are? I think that one's a little harder. Maybe harder to recognize the instances or think of like a clear example.
Well, one of the examples I always give when I give a speech is growing up playing basketball on the local court. If someone came in, didn't look like us, when no one knew who he was, there were and they were shorter. He was shorter than us. We automatically had biases that he couldn't play the game basketball, and he would have to wait till it was his turn to pick a team. We wouldn't go out and say, hey, who are you? And what's your skill set? We just automatically had a bias against that person.
Yeah. So there are some physical features that might be associated with different skills. You might make an assumption based on those things. I have done this myself. I recently, I'm an advisor for Association of Women in Communication at OSU, and our current president is a freshman. And my first thought was like, oh no, a freshman, she's not going to know what to do. She's going to be lost. She's going to be so busy and overwhelmed with college. She's going to be a terrible president. And so far she's awesome. But I just assumed that because of where she is in school, kind of the seniority and the status of that. We'll think about some more examples as we go, but that's something I want you to kind of keep in the back of your mind, how this applies to you, not just like, oh yes, I've seen other people definitely do these things, but think about yourself and how you've done these things. It turns out we all have biases, and we're all having to either consciously not act on them, or we're just acting on them and not necessarily even knowing we're doing it. And so that's what an implicit bias is about. And coming to recognize them when they're happening is the only way to be able to do something about that. So now we're going to kind of go through the definitional phase. What is an implicit bias? So obviously we all have biases. Like, I prefer, vanilla over chocolate when it comes to ice cream. I'm biased, that Oklahoma is better than Texas, or that OSU is better than OU, or like whatever. Those are like biases that we might have. But those are all explicit. Like I know I have them. I prefer these certain things. I'm aware of my preferences. I allow those things to guide decisions sometimes. An implicit bias is a discriminatory bias that we have that we don't even necessarily know that we have. It's more on the subconscious level. It's an instant snap judgment, or even a feeling we might get, or an assumption we might make about someone without having any information that leads us to that judgment. Your entire life is full of new situations and decision-making processes all day. From the moment you wake up until you go to bed, you're inundated with new information, and you have to make decisions quickly in order to act. Mental shortcuts like implicit biases are a protective development that we have, evolutionarily to help us function in our busy society. We can't help it. It's how you stay safe from danger. Like if a lion is coming, you don't have time to stop and think about the situation. You have to act immediately. And so we have these developed for everything in life. Like you can make a snap decision in traffic. You can make snap decisions, when you're scrolling through your social media feed. And this is an implicit bias that we've developed culturally because of our cultural context, based on lots of different types of input, and we'll talk about how they develop, but it's an automatic and subconscious process. You don't necessarily know you have it, but it's possible to become aware of what they are. So right now you may not be aware that you have any, but we all have them. Sometimes our implicit biases match our explicit attitudes and beliefs. So, for example, if you have an automatic kind of negative reaction to people of another race, and you are also like aware that you are, a racist, then that would be an example of someone who has both the reaction that's an implicit bias and also has sort of like embraced that kind of bias. But most people don't do that. Like, how many people do you know who are like, yes, I am a terrible racist? Like, that's not normally how people identify. There are people, but for the most part, our implicit biases and our explicit attitudes and beliefs are contradictory. Usually we say we value diversity, we don't judge a book by its cover, we listen to diverse viewpoints, blah, blah, blah. But really, we kind of have this first reaction, and then we have to kind of like allow ourselves to act on our values instead of on our first gut response. That can be hard for people to accept about themselves, because especially if you're, attending a diversity and inclusion webinar, you probably are someone who cares about these issues. And so it can be really hard to kind of accept that that might be happening in order to do something differently moving forward. So an implicit bias would sort of be like answering this or filling in this little prompt. When I see a person with a certain characteristic, I subconsciously assume they are another kind of characteristic that's actually kind of unrelated without any further information. So when I see a person with tattoos, I subconsciously assume they are young, irresponsible, reckless, unreliable, maybe they do drugs and alcohol, like, I don't know, whatever you would assume. That's what you're assuming based on this other characteristic that is a part of the person. So this can apply to any characteristic. It's usually visual characteristics that we make these judgments on first. But it's also other things too. We mentioned political parties a second ago. So there are other things that are kind of like categories that we self-select into rather than things we're born into. Tattoos would be another example of that. So in terms of business, I think it's really important to make a distinction between protected and non-protected classes when it comes to these biases. The protected classes are the categories of identity that you are not allowed to discriminate against legally, like you cannot. It's hard to prove in a lawsuit that someone was biased against you and that is what led to their actions that, prevented you from being promoted in an organization. But often that can be the case, that those actions build up over time. But the protected classes are race or color or ethnicity, basically your origin, religion or creed, the sex categories legally are pregnancy, sexual orientation, and gender identity, your national origin, an advanced age over 40, disability of any type, including just genetic predispositions, and also veteran status. Those are our protected categories by law. But the non-protected classes are also areas that you might have implicit biases. And they're also important to keep in mind when we're thinking about diversity and inclusion. And there's a lot of other ones too we could add to the list. So I thought of some, but you might think of others. Familial status, so you might be biased against parents. So legally, you cannot, for example, fire a woman for being pregnant. But some people might not want to hire a woman who has lots of kids. Familiar status, I also mentioned cohabiting. So we live in Oklahoma, it's a fairly conservative state. Some people will have a bias against someone who's living with their partner rather than being married to them. So that's another category that you often see these biases. Class bias is rampant. So that's, assuming something about someone based on their educational level or their social class or social status. Social memberships. So, what clubs you're a part of, who you know, those kinds of things, like who you hang out with. That could also be things like church memberships, or, political parties. Criminal records, it's easy to assume that someone who has a criminal record is a certain type of person, and that overlooks, the fallibility of our political justice system, as well as the high proportion of minorities that are incarcerated, as well as the fact that people can change, even if someone's criminal record is accurate, if an accurate reflection of their past. Citizenship status. So this has to do with all levels of citizenship and the kind of keywords that we use to describe it. And then things like body size and shape, and really just appearance in general. Studies show that people who are deemed more conventionally attractive are more likely to get positions and promotions and raises. And people who are not conventionally attractive are usually deemed as less effective at their job. In fact, it even goes down to things like wearing makeup. So women who wear makeup are considered to be more professional and more adept at their work than women who choose not to wear makeup. Even though that's just like not a preference that is applied evenly across the genders. Try and move forward here. There we go.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead,
Did you
Daryl.
say that people develop those biases in the non-protected classes based on their environment, where they were raised, how they were raised, what they've been exposed to in life?
Yeah, primarily. We'll talk a little bit more. I have a slide coming up on where these come from, but primarily it's our culture that we absorb from a very young age. So
Very
an
good.
example here would be, if someone says the word nurse, Carly drew a line. I didn't know you could draw lines. That was shocking. Sorry. Okay, so
I'm sorry. I'm not trying to draw. I was trying to unmute and
I thought I
oh
was.
my goodness.
It's okay. So if I say, nurse, I'm telling you about a nurse that I met, you're probably going to picture a woman. If I say, if I'm talking to you about a scientist that I know, then you're more likely to picture a man. Those are just some, obvious softball examples. But when you're hiring for a position, if you're looking for a public relations coordinator, do you think that's going to be a pretty woman? Like, is that what you're assuming you're going to be hiring? Are you open to other options? If you're hiring for an engineer kind of role, are you picturing that being a man? And how do minorities fit into that? If you have these certain preferences, are you picturing a white person? Like if you're already envisioning a certain type of person filling the role, it's harder then to act on filling the role with anybody that didn't fit your presuppositions, regardless of their qualifications, because you've made a mental image of what you think that person will be like. Okay. I think the line's going to stay with us. I'm not totally sure. So who has implicit biases? So this is like, we always talk about people and their stereotypes and people and their prejudice. And we tend to think of the majority class, like cis white men would be the most biased because they're the majority. And then people who are, cis white women would probably be next, and then so forth. Like there's like this hierarchy we think of, but actually everyone has implicit biases, and it's usually the same ones because most of us are like acculturated in a very similar environment with the same type of media and pop culture. And it's very common and more common than not that you have these biases against people in your own identity categories. And that's the worst part, I think, is like, it feels like, it just feels like it goes against who you know yourself to be. And it does in a lot of ways. Our brains do that. They kind of work against us sometimes. So, there have been a lot of studies that show, for example, when children are presented with two dolls, a white doll and a black doll, both the white and black children preferred the white doll. And both the white and black children described the white doll as being pretty, the white doll as being smart, and not the black doll. So these biases cross not just race, but all the different categories. So we kind of internalize some of the biases that we see in the media over time. Your brain is really a sponge, and it's receiving messages all the time, even when you're not consciously, attending to those messages or assenting to those messages. And so sometimes we struggle with these types of biases. So having them doesn't mean you are acting against them. It doesn't mean that you're prejudiced against your own group. What it means is that you are subject to the same instant reaction, sometimes in certain situations, that you might have values that contradict. So in that case, those are even more important, I think, to be aware of, so that you can, think about how you might act against or come to recognize and mitigate your own biases. So here's where they originate, Daryl. This is what you're referring to. Most of them come out of our cultural context. And this is just, like I said, starting at a very, very young age, infants are observing everything around them. They're making connections between what they see and how people react to different things. So the norms in your family of origin, usually the earliest concepts that you have that start to form your biases. So I'm sure we all come from different types of families with different value sets and different beliefs. But that starts to impact us at a very early age. So if you grew up in a religious family, or you grew up in, a family that had different biases or prejudices, you start to absorb those. Keep in mind, your parents also have implicit biases that they are acting on without necessarily knowing. And so they're passing those actions on to you. So if your parents in the grocery store have the physical reaction of moving away from a person of color when they come past them in the grocery store, or like physically distancing themselves, they don't have to say to you that, you should be afraid of people of color. They're showing you, and you feel it as a child, and you absorb it as a child, and you act the same way because that's what you learn. That's how we learn, through our environment. And so it can be anything like that. The general implicit biases that we all tend to absorb tend to align with whatever the broader social hierarchies are in any society. So it's not just an American thing, but like across cultures, we tend to absorb biases that privilege and prefer whoever is the majority, the ruling class. So if you think of America like a class system or even a caste system, think about who's at the top. It would be the rich, mostly white people. And then kind of think about the categories and how they go down. The lowest castes in society in America would be the people who are not given as many opportunities than the people who struggle the most. We imprison Black men at a rate that's like, I don't want to say a statistic off the top of my head because I can't remember, but it's much, much higher than the general population. And I think it's very clear that our system privileges people who are straight and white at the top, and people who are queer or otherwise different from that move down the hierarchy. And that's how the biases end up working to support that social system. So that's the function of the biases. That's not necessarily what people intend. Like, there's a difference between our intentions and the function of something in society. So we might not mean to reinforce the social hierarchies in our culture, but that's the function of having these biases. By having them, we help to kind of prop up that system. So that's why we want to tear them down. Nearly all the members of a certain culture will share these. So the more that you are and your family of origin was embedded in mainstream American culture, the more you would have the same kinds of biases that other people tend to have. If you were more removed from that because of your family's physical location, maybe you lived in a really rural area with less interaction with people, maybe you were cloistered in a very religious environment, then you might have slightly different ones, but they tend to still follow the same hierarchy. They really do. Finally, your personal experiences obviously can add to these things. Every time you have, the experience of like touching a hot burner on the stove, it's like creating pathways in your brain that help you to remember not to do that the next time. And so if you have an experience with a certain kind of person that's not a positive one, that can create that kind of physical, like your muscle memory for a response to that kind of person. So if you were attacked by a blonde person, you might have a reaction when you see people with blonde hair, just sort of a gut reaction at first when you first encounter them. And it's not always the case, but it doesn't have to be a personal experience. And this is the problem in our society, which is media saturated. Your personal experiences include the things you see on TV, the things you see in the media, the things you see on the news, because you experience those as if they're happening to you. Mediated images are not natural. That's not like how our bodies are designed to experience the world. We're designed to experience it through firsthand experience and like actually seeing and feeling things. And so when you're constantly seeing messages in the media that are biased messages, or that have certain messages behind them about the types of people that are being shown, that builds your own understanding of the world from a very, very early age. So I was thinking back to all the Disney movies I grew up watching and how the bad characters always like super ugly and scary and the good characters beautiful. And that's a really basic one, but that's across media in America. And that's still a thing. It's not just old Disney movies. And so you start to associate beauty with goodness and ugliness, or even like physical differences. I'm thinking of like Ursula or the Hunchback of Notre Dame, although he's a good character. There's the way that differences depicted in media aimed at children can really start to affect your opinions over time of people who have those types of differences. Daryl, I saw you unmuted yourself. I think you've got a thought.
Oh yeah, because I wrote down the note. I watch television, and for that same reason, you can watch something like Me TV, which goes back into the old days of the black and white of Andy Griffin, In the Heat of the Night, Matlock, and those movies. And you can see how people were portrayed just based on the color of their skin. And then as you progress to current day, you can see some of those same biases being illuminated in current television. Is that nothing's changed, that if you are the big, tall, ugly person, back then you're going to still be the big, tall, ugly person, mean person here. And that really influenced, from what I could tell in my short time on this earth, that really influences a lot of people because they continue. It's amazing, even the music they listen to.
Yeah, I'm teaching a class right now on representations of Native Americans in pop culture. And we start with like, the early colonial days and move all the way to now. And it's the same thing. These depictions are very stereotypical. There's words like savage and chief and squaw, that are thrown around. The good characters are beautiful, like Pocahontas, they're always like a beautiful Indian maiden. The bad characters are ugly and have, overly red skin and large noses. And they're, like the tribe in Peter Pan, the cartoon. And so those kind of depictions, not only do those things become a part of your cultural language in your brain, like the way that you understand and interpret cultural differences, but it also becomes a part, if you're a member of that group, a part of how you understand your own role in society. So even if you don't think subconsciously that you are like that person, you understand from a very early age that society views you that way, and that's how you're understood to be. And there is quite a bit of psychology behind the idea that we become kind of how people expect us to be. So if you tell a kid they're such a bully, they're going to bully, and because they're trying to live up to that expectation of what you kind of speak into them. And that's true for a lot of our experiences and how we interact with the world. In addition to media and pop culture depictions, which tend to be reinforcing these stereotypes, second and third hand social stories also do this same kind of work. So, your grandparents or your family members tell you about their experiences that they've had, that are firsthand experiences. And so those also build into your stockpile of associations that you have mentally. For example, my grandparents used to tell me about a friend that they had. My grandparents, I love my grandparents. They were like my parents to me. They used to tell me about a friend they had that was a Black man. And my grandpa would always say, when he was telling me about this guy and how he was seeing him, or they were going out for coffee, he would be like, yeah, he's such a good old boy. He just stays in his house and I stay in my house. And I came to understand that he meant that we can be friends, but we can't share that kind of friendship. We can't be actual friends. We can't be close. And it's because this man is Black and I'm white. And so that's the difference. And so some of those things, the social stories or the way that we absorb it from our families, they're not necessarily explicit. It's an implied understanding or an allusion to something that you kind of put together yourself. So all of these things kind of build together. It's not just one thing. You don't get an subconscious bias against a class of people from one experience or one factor, but it's all of them together that build up over time, starting when you're born all the way up through now and who you are now, that has contributed to any biases that you possess. And so some of us will have stronger biases in certain areas, depending on where you were raised and how you were raised. If you had a very conservative religious upbringing, you may have stronger biases against people who live a lifestyle that's not like yours, or people who are LGBTQ, or people who cohabit, or have tattoos, or whatever your religion was against. And so it really just depends on how much exposure you had to the different messages growing up. So, okay, we got them. That's not good news, but like, it's better to know you have them, right? So you can do something about them if you're going to have them anyway. So we've got them. So it's safe to assume that you have absorbed most of the primary cultural biases that exist in America. Absorb them at least to the extent that they are present in your subconscious, and they can guide your gut reaction to another person when you first meet them. That doesn't mean that you have all of them as strongly as the others, but you probably have all of the primary biases that are in our society. There's also ways you can like scientifically identify which ones are stronger than others. And this is through implicit association testing. And Harvard has a resource available online. It's free. They do kind of like collect your data to add to their research project, but not your personal data, just your responses. But they have association tests for lots of different types of categories that you can do to see what your response is. It's based on response time, and that's really all. So you're shown images on the screen, and you're shown an image and a word, and you have to, like, as quick as you can, without giving yourself time to think about it, like say yes or no. You're going to click like an arrow or something on your keyboard to say yes or no. So it'll show a disabled person or a person in a wheelchair and the word lazy, and you have to say yes or no really quickly. So if you have to stop and think about it, it takes longer. And if you had to stop and think about it, it's because you have an implicit bias. So they'll be able to tell you at the end of the test, like if you took longer to say nice things about people who are different, then you have a bias against those people. If it doesn't take you as long to say good things about people who are not different from you, or who are more like the mainstream norm category, then you don't have that bias, which usually we don't have biases against the mainstream norm categories. So you can go through some of those on your own time. You can have, people at your workplace look through these, and you can look for ones that are especially relevant to your situation, but they have lots of them. They have race, ethnicity, they have disability, they have body size, lots of different categories, and they're interesting and difficult. I don't really recommend like doing this or telling people to do it without then helping them know what to do about it. And that's the only problem I have with the Harvard project, is that you can find out you're really a biased person, and then what? Like, if you start to believe you're just a biased person, then you kind of can give yourself a pass if you do a biased thing, because you're a biased person, right? And that's how we are because of society. So if you find out you have these biases, the next step is then to figure out, what do you do? Another thing you can do, and I recommend you do anyway, even if you're not trying to figure out your implicit biases, is just become more self-aware about your own responses to situations and people. It's the initial response, it's the physiological response, like your heart rate and your sweating and your, physically, what you're doing with your body. When you meet or see people who are different than you, that can tell you a lot about how your body feels. And just because you feel that way initially doesn't mean that that is the appropriate response to have. This is contradictory to a lot of the messages we get about, like, trust your gut instincts, you can go with your heart or whatever. And sometimes I believe that, like, sometimes, like, if you feel like you're in danger, you need to protect yourself, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of times the reason we have the gut responses we have is because of our acculturation and not because of reality. And so it's actually dangerous to just trust it and just act on it without investigating where it comes from.
You're asking people to get out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
You're asking people to actually look at themselves in the mirror and say, oh my God,
Yeah.
I did have that reaction, and then ask themselves the question, why?
Mm-hmm.
Woo, that's deep.
I know, and it hurts, honestly, it does. And especially because these contradict our values. And if you're doing all this work to find out this stuff, then you do care about these things. Like you care and you don't want to be a biased person. Understanding that we all have them and getting mad at the culture is one way to start. Like that's the first thing, like understanding that the culture has done this to you and there are these cultural messages. That's the first place, I think, but that's not, can't be enough because you can't change the world. You have to change yourself and your responses and then try to make an impact on the world and the environment and the culture. So in the workplace specifically, when you make assumptions about someone else in the workplace, you often will act on that assumption without investigating why you're acting the way you're acting. So this is the gut reaction. Like if I have a certain feeling about someone, like I'm going to go with candidate A over candidate B because I had a better feeling. It also impacts the way we understand things, the decisions we make in lots of different areas that might lead to these kinds of biases. So, you know, you might have, like I said before, that kind of bias that like the person I'm going to be hiring is probably going to be like, you know, a white woman. That's the kind of person I imagine as being, you know, whatever the role is. So then that might impact where you advertise or what candidates you bring in for an interview, with everything else being equal. And it does, in fact, lead us to act in ways that contradict our values if we don't first investigate the biases and like understand when they're happening so we can prevent them from influencing our decision-making process. Okay, here's some specific things that have been identified in the research that happen to minorities in the workplace. And I'm sure none of these are a shock to any of you. If you're here, you're aware of some of these issues. Statistics show that in general, in the workplace, minorities tend to be passed over in favor of white male candidates when both are equally qualified. That minorities are often pigeonholed into roles that don't suit their training and talent because people assume that's what they can do. Wage differences increasing at higher organizational levels. So people who fit into different minority groups tend to be paid less than people who are, you know, white males. And those differences increase and increase and increase as you move up the corporate ladder or whatever ladder you're on. So it's a smaller wage difference to start out and it doesn't look as big, but they tend to get much, much bigger as you move up. People are less likely to offer experiences and mentorships to people who are minorities or who fit into some of these other categories based on their implicit biases, which prevents them from getting the experience they need to get the promotion. So then when it's promotion time, it's easy to say, well, this person has all this experience and qualifications and this person doesn't. So obviously I'm giving the promotion to this person, but you gave them the experience and you know, you mentored them and you taught them how to get that, you know, that internship or that extra certification or whatever they needed. There's a lower probability of minorities being promoted in general. So not only are there the wage differences, but even getting there to have the experience of a wage difference is much less likely for minorities. There's a lower ratio promoted into leadership roles and a lower proportion of minorities in executive leadership, which makes sense because they're not getting promoted there. And it's also often that executive leadership of companies originally starts out by being the person that, you know, starts the organization. They tend to be the people who are well resourced and well networked, which tend to be white men. And then they tend to hire their friends or people who are similar to themselves. And so it kind of exacerbates the problem. So it's a cycle and it doesn't just stop unless it's interrupted. So to be perfectly clear, discrimination and equity will continue to persist across your organization unless you investigate these types of biases that might lead to them. Like they just will, because it's a cycle that continues itself. It has to be interrupted intentionally. Implicit biases are not on the conscious level, they're not intentional, and people don't recognize them happening. And so because of those things, those features of those biases, it has to be consciously addressed and intentionally addressed in order for it to stop. This slide is the slide that I really hesitated to post here because I think we all know these things, but I also felt really bad just posting them. Like this is the painful part. These are some of the big biases that really impact the workplace. Except maybe the good singers in sports, that maybe doesn't impact the workplace as much. But there were others I could have put on here, and I'm sure you can think of more. I'm really interested if you can think of any that you are starting to recognize in yourself, biases you might hold, or even biases you think have been enacted against you because of your identity categories. But here's some examples. So older people are stuck in their ways, they're hard to train, and they're not as tech savvy. That's a cultural bias that we have. We just assume that about older people. And so they're less likely to be hired into jobs that require them to learn a new software program or to be able to interact with younger workers or to learn new ways of doing things. The idea that Black men are dangerous, that's one of the main cultural implicit biases in our culture, one of the biggest ones. And that permeates everything else in the workplace, because if they're dangerous, then everything else becomes problematic. We can't have roles of leadership. They can't be, trusted to do different types of work. And so that the category of danger is impacts every other category. Mothers, less dedicated to their jobs and don't need to be a primary breadwinner. So we still have that holdover idea that of the 2-parent family, and the man brings home the bacon and the wife is like taking care of the kids at home. That's not the reality for almost anybody anymore. Even, families that do have 2 parents at home that are male and female still, because of the cost of living, need both of those incomes most of the time. But we still have that kind of ingrained idea. Probably from watching those old shows you were talking about, Daryl, the Leave It to Beaver and all of that, that makes us think that, if you hire a mother, she can afford to be working in a role that pays less, or she can be paid less than a male counterpart. And if you have to fire some people, you should fire the women in those types of, dispensable roles that you put them in the first place, because the men are going to need their jobs to support their families. And also you can justify it because, the women probably are less dedicated to their job anyway. They were probably going to leave anyway and have more babies or go, be the PTA mom. And so you can kind of justify it with other cultural biases and assumptions. The idea of Black people being good singers and great at sports, I was trying to add in some good biases that we have, or that ones that might be thought of as being positive. So that one, and Jewish people are good with money, Asian people are good at math. We think of those as being like great things, but those are also stereotypes and biases that we have absorbed through our culture. They are not true. They're not statistically provable, like they're not real things. But we still believe them, and they can impact what we think we should do with different people in our organizations, where they should go. I'm not really sure that I can make a great case for Black people being good singers and great at sports affecting the workplace in most places of work. But if you gave me enough time, I could, because I could argue really anything eventually if I thought about it. But the math one, you're more likely to put people who are of Asian descent in roles that involve analysis or finance, and Jewish people as well. They tend to be put into graduate programs at higher rates. And when the programs are dealing with law and dealing with any type of like business accounting or analysis, business programs. So an implicit bias isn't always like on its face a negative thing. It's not always like a negative phrase or a negative word, but it's still a bias. It's still a discriminatory idea, and it pigeonholes people into categories that then ends up being discriminatory. White women are emotional. Okay, now this one's like a little tough as an implicit bias, because we have seen, I don't know about you, but I have seen white women's emotions being used against other minorities so much that white women do often weaponize their emotions. And so there's sometimes our experiences inform our biases, I'll just say. And sometimes that's because there are experiences that support some of these things. In that case, white women being emotional that's still one of the biggest arguments against like women being president. Like even today, like women shouldn't be president because women will be too emotionally unstable and make decisions based on their emotions. I put white women because the opposite tends to be the implicit bias that we have about Black women, which is that Black women are more stoic. They have a higher pain tolerance. They tend to be harsher and tend to be more angry and tend to not be great in like customer facing roles. And so those are stereotypes that we have, and that we can then, you can imagine ways in which an applicant for a job, because of their race or because of their gender, would then be thought of as a better or worse candidate for that job based on these factors. There are others. We don't have to talk about each in detail. Can you think of any others that I don't have here that either have been kind of directed at you or that you maybe are recognizing in yourself that you might have as a bias?
Something that is really at the forefront, and I know Daryl will relate to this, in our community, week ago, Monday, we had a resident come to the city council meeting and was opposed to a development. And she said, I'm opposed to this with duplexes and apartments. They're just people they're just a different class of people. She totally said this, and that that's why she was opposed to the development, because she has this bias against people who rent and makes assumptions about what kinds of neighbors they'll be. And this is it's a huge problem in the Edmond community, and I don't know exactly how to address it, except to sometimes say something to at least let residents who rent know that that's not okay. To speak and make those assumptions and then advocate for them. It's really, really, really disturbing. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear.
That's a really common one. I live on a street in Tulsa that is mostly renters. And I've heard that same comment about our property values. Like our property values are lower because most of the people on our street are renters. And the renters that live on my street have been there as long as I have, and they're neighbors, and they're great neighbors. And so
Right.
That's totally different than trying to address implicit bias among people in decision-making positions in your workplace. Honestly, in your own workplace, trying to address these issues is going to be a lot more straightforward than trying to change the cultural narrative and the mindset of the community. I'm not saying it's not possible. The problem with changing your biases is that you have to want to. And so y'all are opting in to this conversation, but that lady is not going to opt into the conversation. So really it starts at the top and works its way down. If we can impact our institutions of education, religious groups, and schools primarily, we can start to see some broader social change. You can do smaller scale things, as a city to try to help change the conversation. Some kind of a public service marketing campaign about the value of renters to Edmond's economy, and like featuring like a day in the life of a family, putting a face to the issue. That tends to sway people's opinions. Like I said, experience is one of the formers of our biases. And so if people see things that contradict their biases, it helps them to let go of their biases. So people tend to be more moved to change their conceptions by examples of people rather than by statistics and numbers. So while I would include something like what percentage of Edmond's people are renters and how they contribute to the economy and big money, I would also have like a really cute family, like this adorable family struggles to make ends meet, and no, they can't afford a down payment on a house because the economy prevents that. Or, the family, it's a single mom, or it's, they have college loans or whatever, those are real scenarios. But when people see a real person and they see the struggle that real person has, then they can start to recognize that their narrow categories for black and white in reality are like actually gray. Like things are not that simple. So, I mean, if I were in your position, I would do that, something like that, some kind of a PSA, some marketing campaign, social media campaign, something like that to start the conversation. Start doing things as a city that prioritizes renters and shows that you care about the value they add to the city, because other people absorb that too. And then, whatever you can do politically and socially to invest in the institutions of education in your society. So, supporting, I don't know, social emotional learning in schools or something like that. There might be an issue in Oklahoma right now. Cody, I see that you have a little hand emoji. Does that mean you have something? Cody? I don't think he does. I think he ran away. This happens all the time. I'm used to it. Okay. Well, Cody, if you ever come back, not that you can hear me if you're not there. Here's some examples from some studies that were done, some recent studies.
Hey, Rosemary.
Yeah.
I wanted to jump in really quick. Going back to the different biases, it's something interesting that sometimes there's just a bias on someone's name.
Yes.
Because like I've been blessed, I feel like, but my last name is hyphenated. So if I were going to go into a good old boy organization, I wouldn't be even considered for certain positions potentially just based on my name.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Just based on that. And like we have friends, and this is my favorite example because they're our family, but her name is Keisha Jackson and his name is Alan Jackson. She's white and he's black, but their names do not match what you would think when you just hear their name.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's just that simple of just bias on someone's name and getting pushed, along just because of that. So
that's absolutely true. Some of the examples here, there have been a lot of studies done on a resume, just the resume, where people in the study are just given a resume. They're not given anything else. And they're not told what the study is for, what they're looking for. They're like, they ask people who are participating to, hey, could you help us evaluate these different resumes? We're trying to find a candidate. So they give them a stack and it'll have lots of different resumes, but in them, there will be one that says like Brian and one that says Karen. And they're identical except for their names. So they'll rearrange some of the stuff so it doesn't look identical physically, but it's the same information. They have the same qualifications, but they'll put them in with other ones to kind of throw people off. And then they're kind of measuring who's going to recommend Brian or who's going to recommend Karen. So basically how they arrange the study is everybody else is not qualified. All the fake, the fake resumes that are not Brian and Karen are not qualified. Brian and Karen are the only qualified ones and they're equally qualified. So this is for an academic position, 2-to-1, both male and female professors recommend Brian over Karen, all else being equal. Like, it's just bizarre. Like, why? Oh, I see there's some things happening in chat and Cody. Sorry, Cody. It's all, oh, I'm not the host. Am I? No, I'm not the host. I can't change. I'm sorry. Cody, if you can't figure it out, you can just put it in the chat. That'll be fine. And I'll read it well, I don't know your voice, so that wouldn't work. So that's a faculty position. So an undergrad lab manager position. So these are student applicants. For a lab manager position, male and female science professors both rated male applicants more competent, hireable, and suitable for both mentoring. And then when they were asked what the recommended salary would be, they recommended higher salaries for the male applicants. And then this last one, I think, gets to what you're talking about, Tom. So for these types of positions, sales, admin support, clerical positions, and customer service positions, someone named Greg is more likely to be hired than someone named Jamal, and someone named Jennifer is more likely to be hired than someone named Lakeisha, all else being equal. And so that is exactly what you're saying. It's like this name has a connotation that we're going to assume that these people are Black and these other people are white because their names are Greg and Jamal and Jennifer and Lakeisha. And so just knowing nothing else about them except what we're assuming. So it's not even like necessarily true in the case you're talking about. We're just going to assume it, and then we're going to we're going to hire people based on those things. So I don't know if you all saw the story that was in the news for a while about a woman who was, or a family that was Black, and they were trying to sell their house and they couldn't sell it. And then they like concealed who they were and had like someone else showing the house. And so people wouldn't know that they were Black. And they sold the house for like more than asking price really quickly or something. And it was a big difference in what happened once people didn't think Black people owned the house. So this kind of crosses over everything in our culture. In the workplace, obviously, even just the name can keep you from getting in the door. So there's some things, you know, if you're an applicant of color or you have a name that fits like these categories, you can try to mask it and try to like bypass people's biases, but it really shouldn't be the applicant's obligation to do that to try to get a job. That's not equitable. So it's our responsibility on the organizational side to fix the systems that are preventing people's applications because of these things. I recommend having someone blind the resumes for you. You can have, you know, the person who receives them to their email box, Photoshop it, you know, turn it into a PDF and black out the name and then send it around, or anything else that might be an identifier, send it around without that information. Not just blacking out names that sound like Lakeisha, but blacking out everybody's names, because otherwise it doesn't work. So be sure you do that. That's one thing you can do. I always tell my students not to put their pictures on their resume, but that's becoming much more common. Younger students want to use, you know, Canva or Photoshop to make this really fancy, beautiful resume, and they want to put their faces on it. Historically, we didn't do that because we know that people will hire the prettier candidate or the more handsome candidate. They really will. So if you receive applications like that, cover up the image. Okay, Cody's got his question. Millennial has been used negatively for the past 10 years, especially during the recession. I'm 35. There are even older millennials. I'm an older millennial, the elder millennial. Have you seen that Liza, what's her name? The comedian. YouTube it after this presentation. It's very important. It's called Elder Millennial. We're still often considered to be kids with no experience, causes me dress in ways to appear older. So yeah, I mean, I've had that experience too. I'm an elder millennial, not much older than you, but I am elder. And so millennial can be used that way. Gen Z now is getting ready to experience the same thing, but also like boomer. I mean, we all know that's a bad word now. So like it goes all the different ways. We have our mental associations of what each generation is like and what they would be like as a colleague or as a part of our organization. Usually the bias is for younger people. We want younger, fresh faces. We want people who are energetic and can like, you know, be trendy on social media and help us be cool as a company, you know, and make our culture better. And so that usually means younger people, which is a bias against older people. Millennial has been used negatively. I do agree with that. I think millennials are starting to come into our own, but I don't know. Because I think I think that bias is starting to shift down towards Gen Z, which is my college students and high school students right now. Okay. Oh, how are we doing on time? Because I want to be sure I get to the strategies and not just talk about all the problems.
I think we're doing okay on time. Typically, we wrap this up right at about 9:30, 9:25, 9:30. So,
okay. All right, thanks. So here's some things you can start looking for in your organization to try to start nipping this stuff in the bud. Like, don't even let people use their biases they might have. So one thing is to think about evaluative language. How do you evaluate candidates, and what words do you put in things like job ads, or, you know, if you do an annual evaluation or a quarterly evaluation, what kinds of words and phrases are you using to indicate that someone's doing a good job? Another thing to look at is letters of recommendation too, if you're writing them, and also when you're reading them, to be aware that letters of recommendation that are written for people often use different words that are loaded with lots of meanings that are cultural. I noticed this. I evaluate graduate applications for our grad program, and the letters of reference that are written on behalf of women always talk about how they are really personable and fun to work with, and they're kind and they're caring, and they have this really kind demeanor. And the ones that are about men are always just about what they do. Like they have done this task and this job, they have this certification, and they get these grades, and like they're much more task specific. So it makes it sound like the men are more qualified, but really they all have done the same kinds of stuff. They're applying for a grad program. They haven't had a time to have all these experiences. So they're basically the same kinds of candidates. So there's certain words like these that kind of trigger certain biases. You might picture a different kind of person when you think of someone who is accomplished versus thinking of someone who is insightful or compassionate. So if the word is not actually telling you something about whether someone can do a good job at the task that you need them for, you don't need to have that word. You're risking more than you're gaining by having certain kinds of words in your language. I think I already said that first part. So yeah, here's another thing to think about. So the problem is, if qualitative evaluations, like, using those words we were just looking at, if those are problematic, then should we do quantitative ones instead? The problem is that performance evaluations that just rely on scales to measure things are often filled out differently depending on who the candidate is. So we have a different anchor for our judgment of productivity, for example, for a man versus a woman. So men who have accomplished fewer goals are still seen as more competent and having more accomplishments than a woman who has accomplished more than he did. So everything else being equal, if she has 10 things that she's done that quarter and he has 7, people tend to see him as having more. And the reason, I think, comes from the bias that we have about women's productivity being less effective. So maybe she did 10 things, but they weren't as good as his 7 things. And so people kind of move the anchor for what they think of as good. Obviously, this would also be true for if you're measuring something like friendly or unfriendly. It takes a lot more for a woman to be considered friendly than it does for a man to be considered friendly. Like, I have to smile constantly, whereas a guy just has to say good morning as he walks past me in the hall. And then I'm like, oh, he said good morning to me. We must be friends now. But really, it's just because he doesn't have to do anything else. And I have to be like, how was your day? Isn't the weather great? And smile all the time. So, even if you try to kind of quantify some of those characteristics, we will still end up anchoring our judgment differently for people, but depending on our biases. So, if the scale that you're trying to measure is like, collegiality and how well they work with others on their team. Like for a male candidate, especially a white male candidate, collegiality would be like how well they delegate responsibility. And for a woman, it would be like, do they bring cookies to the office? So it's a different kind of thing, different expectations of what that word would mean in different contexts. So it's not necessarily better to try to quantify those things instead of just getting rid of some of them. Racial bias crosses into salaries, not just hiring. So salaries, promotion salaries, and we already have mentioned getting better jobs. So let's talk more specifically really quickly. So the first thing to do is engage with your own biases before you try to bring this kind of work to your workplace. You need to identify and acknowledge what yours are, figure out where some of them came from so you can start recognizing when they're happening. Start recognizing how you feel and how you act when you're engaging with these biases. Like each type of bias has a different physiological manifestation. The fear response is easiest to recognize. It makes your hands sweat, makes you feel nervous or anxious, your heart rate will increase. You might physically distance yourself from someone. So that's like if you're scared of them. So if you see somebody with like lots of tattoos or lots of piercings or like a shaved head or like someone who's a Black man generally, or especially a tall, big Black man, like those responses can tell you, oh, I'm having a fear response. My body must think that I'm in danger. Why do I think that? Like, why would my body be thinking that right now? And then kind of, assess whether it's a rational response to the situation, like this person's approaching you with a gun, or if it's an irrational response, which is there's nothing happening and I'm having this response to this one person and not to other people. Other responses will make you feel differently. So like you might feel dismissive, you might feel superior, you might feel irritated. Like, why do you feel that way? What are you assuming about this person that gives you that impression? Once you become self-aware of your biases, then you can move them from implicit to explicit. So when you know, if I have this response, it means I'm having this kind of bias, then you can begin to cognitively move yourself through mindfulness, and it takes effort, but you kind of move yourself to being more aware when they're happening. I mean, you won't be 100% perfect all the time. You'll still have moments where you experience the bias, but that's not the problem. So I remember I was raised very religiously, and I remember in church they used to say, like, it's not being tempted that's the problem, it's sinning that's the problem. So that's what I want you to think of when it comes to this. Like, it's not just experiencing the first initial response. It's then, what are you going to do with that? Because your culture gave that to you. That's the gift of America to you, is like having that bias. But then what are you going to do? It's up to you then to turn that into making a decision based on the facts and the situation, and not based on that first gut response. Once you kind of recognize those things among yourselves, take this back to your workplace. I recommend implicit bias training for anyone that makes decisions in these categories. Obviously, anyone who's managing a team and delegating responsibilities, hiring committees, anyone who's even just writing the language for hiring, for advertising, anyone who's responsible for awards, recognition within the organization, retention, promotion, and tenure, or whatever your organization has, whoever's in charge of making those decisions. Anybody who makes decisions about other people in your workplace needs to know if their decisions are being led by their own personal responses, like their initial gut reactions. And so that can be everybody in some organizations, and other organizations, it's not quite everybody, but it's usually a lot of people, because most people have some impact on other people. Even, I've had jobs where I was not a manager of anybody, but I was still required to do peer evaluations. Well, now I have a need to recognize if I'm biased in my own evaluations of my peers, if it's going to impact their potential for advancement. Look through your processes from start to finish. Like, how do you do these different things in your workplace, and what are you basing it on? How do you choose who is in charge of hiring? In some places, there's like an HR person and a hiring manager, but there's also someone writing the job ad, someone coming up with the qualifications. And often that's a team who is trying to figure out what need this role will be filling. So whoever's in charge of these processes, how are they doing it? Like, where are they getting the information? And it's never a good idea to just base your job ad on the ones you've used before without examining them further, or base them on ones you find online for similar positions, because they are going to have some of this stuff built into them, the expectations built in. Where you're advertising, how you're reviewing your applicants and deciding which ones to promote further in the process of hiring. How you choose who comes in for an interview or a Zoom interview, and then how you conduct the interview and the questions you're asking, how you conduct performance reviews, and how you choose who is promoted in the organization. When it comes to the hiring committee, there's a lot of emphasis in academia right now in trying to make the committee itself more diverse, because the thought is, that diversity will like breed diversity. And if the committee is diverse, they're going to look for people who are more similar to them, or more diverse candidates will feel comfortable. And it is important to have a variety of viewpoints, but often this ends up really overburdening people who are minorities, because they have to serve on every committee now. They have to bring the diverse viewpoint, or, they're tokenized by their organization. And so that's not always the answer. It's better, like I said before, even people who are minorities tend to have some of the biases that they've absorbed from their culture. So just because someone fits into a certain identity category doesn't mean that they're gonna, be free of having any type of potential bias. So it's kind of a bias itself, or it's more of a stereotype, I guess. If you're assuming that a diverse, a person who fits into your diversity buckets is then going to speak on behalf of their group in all situations. So it's better to train everybody in implicit biases and help them understand how these work, and then rotate who serves on these types of committees, rotate whose responsibility this is, give people an opportunity to opt in and experience the training, and then do, the best job they can do. And it's a good idea to have a diversity advocate in your organization if you don't already. This should be more than like a figurehead or like someone who makes you look really inclusive, but like somebody that actually their job is to serve on these types of committees to make sure that things like the language in the advertisements and the processes you're using are not helping to support the biases that we might have subconsciously. And so the diversity advocate needs to be well-versed in the implicit biases as well. As far as where we advertise, that can also be something that opens us up to more biases. So think about it in terms of like, if we have these biases, we want to act against them, but we also it would be a good idea for us to try to prevent them from happening, like prevent ourselves from being, making it easier for us to have them and act on them. So when you're advertising, sometimes you advertise in places that make it to where you get the kind of candidates you kind of wanted in the first place. So if you only advertise through a network of people, you're going to get people who are like those people. If you advertise on, online websites that tend to gear more towards people of certain backgrounds or something like that. So it's a good idea to try to articulate what efforts you're making to actually recruit a diverse pool of applicants in the first place. Like, what are you doing to try to make sure that you're getting those applicants in the first place? And then, as I mentioned before, try to figure out what you can do to try to evaluate the resumes based on the qualifications and not their names or their photos or any other identifiable type of information. When you're writing job descriptions, it's a good idea to avoid specific language that can communicate a preference for a certain type of person. Mention your enthusiasm for diverse candidates and diverse applicants beyond just the required language of the EEO or whatever your legal team told you to say. Like, actually be enthusiastic. That helps you to communicate it to applicants. Like, if you actually are, then it's more obvious. I really want to emphasize this last bullet about the culture trap. I see this more and more, that organizations are trying to build this culture, the organizational culture and the environment of the organization. And that's, great. Workplaces should have good environments. They should be positive environments for people to work in. But often the culture becomes a shield for an organization to look for candidates that fit a certain kind of demographic. I worked at a place where they were all about their culture, and they really only hired young, beautiful people. I worked there. My department was like so out of place. It was the weirdest experience, but they hired very similar people. They conducted personality testing to decide who to even interview. The personality testing was ensuring that people had very similar backgrounds and identities, but then they were hiring people that they thought would fit into that. And it tended to be, white young people. It just was almost exclusively. I worked at another place that everybody that worked there was an evangelical Christian, except for like 2 people. And we were hiring for someone to work in a research lab, and an applicant came in who their name sounded like they were from an Arab country or that they were Muslim. And the boss said they didn't think that person would be a good culture fit. And I said, do you mean that person is not the same religion as you? Is that what you mean? And he said, well, I think they would be uncomfortable working around all these Christian people. Like, they would be uncomfortable. And so then they made it like they were trying to be nice to this person. But really, that culture thing can be a shield to allow you to continue being, insular in your in your organization instead of broad. And I recommend just not mentioning being a good culture fit as a requirement for your job, because that has so many other connotations. What are you talking about culture? Are you talking about white culture? Are you talking about, oh, sorry, made a blank slide. Are you talking about, Christian culture? Are you talking about conservative culture? Like, what's the culture you're talking about? And who are you excluding by saying that people need to fit into a certain mold? You also miss out on a lot of viewpoints if you try to only hire people who are already similar to what you have.
That's an interesting point. On my last promotion, I did make the statement, you need to hire me because there is no one else like me in this leadership position.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they did hire me. So
yeah. No, that's true. And think about that, as the team making the decisions and hiring. Sometimes people think, well, they wouldn't be a good fit, but think of it in the reverse. Like, what gap will they fill that we don't have? We need someone who has the perspective that they bring, the life experiences that they bring, or the cultural background that they bring. I think I've mentioned most of this, except for this last one, proactively nominating and promoting minorities. A lot of people are really resistant to the idea of just like making a point to like include someone who's a minority in your promotions and awards, and not as a token person, but because they're qualified. The reason for including this is that if you aren't doing this proactively, you might be looking over qualified candidates. Promotions and awards tend to go to people who are the majority group, because they tend to go to people that other people like, that have had those mentoring opportunities or whatever experiences. And so other people who have this qualifications are less likely to receive it. So if that diversity advocate you have, part of their responsibility can be to identify candidates who are qualified to receive these awards. It's not a token award. It's an award based on merit, but it's merit that might be overlooked under other processes if you're not proactively looking for it because of our biases. Offering training across your organization is obviously, I think, a great idea. The National Science Foundation now requires, before they give a grant to anybody, that they have conducted implicit bias training among their whole group of researchers. So I think that's kind of the direction that things are headed. There's too much science supporting the fact that we have these biases and we're making decisions based on them to just ignore it. It's not, an opinion, or it's something that's been shown to be active and affecting our workplaces. Building more awareness of contributions. I mentioned the committee or an advocate that's responsible for finding people to actively promote, and to let other people know. I mentioned before, Kristen, when you mentioned about the bias against renters, that like if you can show people exceptions to their biases, that's a great way to help like tear down their own defenses. And so building awareness of contributions by people who are different from the norm in your organization, which generally is going to be people who are LGBTQ, people who are different racial or ethnic groups, sometimes women, but not always. A lot of organizations are primarily women. But if you can raise awareness of their contributions to the organization by featuring them as Employee of the Month and talking about all the things they do and finding ways to show how impactful they are on the organization, that can help to change the climate in your workplace so that people start to see past their biases and start to understand a more nuanced.
How do you handle when special interest groups want to politicize diversity? We had a constituent come up and tell us that Edmond in the past has done a great job in hiring people, and now they want to put diversity in it, and now you're going to get a lesser quality person. How do you handle the weaponizing of diversity now?
That's tough. I mean, that's a culture change too. That's really difficult. And we're experiencing that in the university too. Right now it's illegal for us to require diversity training for our students and faculty and staff. We can't require it. So it has to be optional. it's always been a requirement here, and now it has to be optional. So again, there's a lot of cultural issues right now that are really conspiring against some of this stuff. I think raising as much awareness as you can of the kind of scientific and strategic basis behind diversity initiatives can help. A lot of times those people or those groups, they're much more interested in the bottom line than they are in, being equitable and being fair and being just. And so if you can change the language that you use, but still, you're still supporting the same issue, but now you're using different language. So, I think mitigating bias is important for ethical reasons, period. But it's also good for you as a company. You can increase, if you increase diversity among your workers, you can increase diversity in your audience and your reach. You can sell more, whatever you're selling. You can, understand more about your audience. So it's a strategic decision too. And I mean, I don't know that I would say it's just a strategic decision in response to that person, because then she's going to say, see, they don't really care about diversity. They just want money, and it's going to backfire in your face. So you kind of have to do both. Like, you have to prioritize it as both things. Diversity, we're interested in diverse candidates who can bring unique perspectives and experiences and help us, build our organization and build our reach, build our whatever you're building. So you're showing that you care about it, but you're also, you're doing it because it's the right thing to do, and it's the right thing for your organization, the best thing for your organization. I think that's the big problem we're all facing too, Daryl. Like, I feel that question very deeply, because we're working on that too. It's hard. Because, for a lot of people, just the word diversity or the word minority candidate, or those things have become like political dog whistles, and they mean more than just what they say. So, when you think about what the real resistance behind that kind of question is, it's like much bigger than just, who's, some qualified candidate's going to get looked over for a job because of your affirmative action or whatever. It's like, it's much bigger than that. It's, a fear of the order of things changing, and like the expectations for certain kind of quality of life changing for people in positions of privilege and power. And that's much bigger. This has been really great. That's everything I have. Here's my contact information, and I'm happy to send these slides to anyone who'd like to just have them to look a little further. I have a resource slide at the end. This is the sources for some of those studies I was mentioning throughout, and also the Implicit project at Harvard. The link is really easy, so you can probably just Google it. But I'm happy to talk to anyone more about, if you have certain issues in your organization and you want some ideas. I really enjoy getting to help actually make a difference in the community. So this is the kind of work that I really love. I'm happy to talk with anyone else or answer any more questions you might have.
I always like for you to give us a homework assignment.
Okay.
Give us one thing that everyone you would recommend for everyone to do, at least one thing after watching this presentation to help them change their self-awareness of their own biases.
Yeah. If I had to recommend one thing, it would be to start evaluating your own biases, because you can't make any kind of bigger change until you start with yourself. And I would do that by keeping a journal for like a week. Like, pick a small thing that you can do, and not a huge journal. And all you have to do in this journal is, only in situations where you run into someone or meet someone new, a new person, whether it's through, an application for a job, or someone that comes in, to visit your workplace, or whatever it is. When you meet someone new, stop and feel how you're feeling, reflect on why you might be feeling that way, and write it down. Like, write down your responses. Start to recognize the patterns. Until you collect enough data about yourself, you can't really assume that what these biases might be or how they're operating. You can also do those implicit tests on the Harvard website if you're interested in that, and kind of explore them. Problem is, there's so many of them that you will pick the ones that are interesting to you, which also is biased a little bit. So unless you want to do them all, which I'd take a long time probably, it's a good idea to just kind of keep keep in touch with how you're feeling about people you actually encounter in real life, like in your actual encounters. Try to figure out what it was that made you feel a certain way. It might be something as easy and simple as like they were different than me, or it could be something much more difficult to put your finger on. Maybe they seem really similar to you, so like it's hard to understand why you might feel that way. But some of those cultural biases can be deeper than just, you know, if they're like me, then I'm gonna like them too.
Very good. We really appreciate the time that you spent with us today. I could go on, but since you've
Same.
given us the contact information, I know I will personally be reaching out to you.
Wonderful. Okay.
And for us all to help ourselves to go to the next level and us actually recognize the various biases that we have each and every day.
Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you very much. We're going to conclude now our session.
Thank you too. This was
Thank
great. I
you.
really appreciate the chance to talk with you all. I hope I get to talk to you more in the future. Have a great day.
Okay, we're going to have some announcements, I think.
We do have a couple of upcoming events. We have business after hours tonight. If you do not have plans tonight from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m., please come and join us. That will be at the Oklahoma Proton Center. We have our business development lunch Tuesday, March 22nd, 11:30 a.m. at the Edmond Chamber. We have speaker Cleo Nash with Independent Shopkeepers, speaking on the state of local retail in Oklahoma. Wednesday, March 23rd at 8 a.m. we have our morning mingle at Primary Health Partners. For all other events, you can check them out on our website at edmondchamber.com. We would like to thank all of the attendees for joining us today. Sorry we went just a little bit long, but it was a great presentation. Okay, I'm going to send you guys off now. Have a good day. Bye.